The amazing thing about Leonardo's notebooks is that they covered every area of science. 100 years before Galileo, he insisted the sun didn't move and therefore the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe. And he used his knowledge of perspective to figure out that each star was a distant sun, as vast and as powerful as our own. The point is that just as we're brought up to know that the sun doesn't go round the Earth, Leonardo was brought up with equal determination to know that it does. So before he could analyse how anything worked, he had to learn to question everything. Describing his scientific method, he said,
"We must doubt the certainty of everything which passes through the senses, but how much more ought we to doubt things contrary to the senses, such as the existence of God and the soul?"
That would have been radical enough when I was at school. So imagine what a shocking thing it was to say in Italy around 1490. Except that few people knew he'd said it, as it was only written in his notebooks. And though he approved of doubting God, he insisted that this was to prove he did exist. Leonardo's view of the universe was that every part of it was linked and affected every other part, so no one part could be studied in isolation. The scientist had to be an artist, the artist a geologist, and so on. If he'd met Stephen Hawking, he'd have said, "You're not a proper scientist, you can't play the lute." And there's the clue as to why he could never get anything finished. He'd start a project, then get distracted and obsessed by something completely different. So in 1490, 8 years after arriving in Milan, he wrote in his diary,
"Time to make a fresh start with the horse."
He carried on with his clay model of the horse in 1493. But then he left it for another 7 years. Then the French invaded, took the model and used it as target practice for their archers. For all his genius, he never seemed to grasp the central idea of work. That if you're a postman and the manager says, "Have you delivered all the mail?" he's not going to be happy if you go, "No, not a single letter. But I have invented a wind-powered corkscrew." The French invasion of the Italian cities set the Renaissance back temporarily, and for the rest of his life, Leonardo was like a footballer in the last years of his career, flitting from one town to another for a season at a time. He became a military advisor to the rulers of Venice, designing what would have been the first ever tank in a diagram that looked like a UFO with wheels. And he invented a diving suit which would enable divers to swim under enemy boats and puncture them. Then he went to Rome to work as a military engineer for Cesare Borgia, whose regime was so corrupt the Venetian ambassador said,
"Every night 4 or 5 murdered men are discovered, so that all Rome is trembling."
You get an idea of Cesare from his title. Cesare Borgia of France, by the grace of God, Duke of the Romagna and of Valencia and Urbino, Prince of Andria, Lord of Piombino, Gonfaloniere and Captain General of the Holy Roman Church. Leonardo assisted Cesare on his military campaigns, compiling maps, draining marshes and accompanying him on his raids, along with a friend who was also working for the Borgias called Vitellozzo. Then one night Cesare had Vitellozzo strangled, and Leonardo became aware that if he stayed in Rome, anything might happen to him. So he decided to return to Florence. He then began a flurry of painting, and in that time he created the most famous work of art in Western history. The wife of a local merchant posed for him, and according to Vasari, he was so concerned that his model should retain an air of joy that
musicians played and sang and continually jested in order to take away any melancholy from the portrait.
It's hard to be objective about the Mona Lisa because you can't be certain whether you're impressed by the beauty of the painting or just by the fact that it's so famous. But the portrait is undoubtedly beautiful, fascinatingly, without being at all sexual. You can't imagine schoolboys going, "Oh, look at the smile on that." In a way, the Mona Lisa is the central point of Leonardo's work, because although he was obsessed with scientific accuracy, this didn't make him uninterested in beauty, passion and the spectrum of human emotions. The result is evidence that a rational approach doesn't detract from the spiritual side of human experience, it adds to it. Partly because she's only just smiling, which is slightly uncomfortable. When someone looks at you like that, you think, what? What is it? What, have I amused you? Have I annoyed you? What is it? What are you thinking? And what she was probably thinking was, when are you going to shut up making that bloody racket? But such is the genius of this work that its mysteries have taken the greatest ever minds in human history to unravel. From Florence, Leonardo went back to Milan, this time at the request of the French who are now ruling the city. And one of the reasons was the courts ordered him to finish the painting of the Virgin of the Rocks that he'd been paid for 20 years earlier. While he was there, he pursued his next obsession, the human anatomy. But to do this, he had to use a method controversial at the time, dissecting bodies. He wrote,
Others may perhaps be deterred by natural repugnance, and if this does not prevent you, you may perhaps be deterred by fear of passing the night hours in the company of these corpses.
Too right you would, bloody nutcase. I wonder if you used to wander around the house going, now what have I done with that eye? I'd forget my own head if it wasn't on a plate in the fridge.